7 ships disappear into the Mediterranean carrying humanity's most innocent cargo. The year is 1212. The water is impossibly blue under an August sun that shows no mercy. From the docks of Marseille, mothers watch white sails shrink against the horizon. They wave until their arms ache. They wave until the ships become dots. They wave until there's nothing left to see but empty sea, and the lie they've chosen to believe, that God will deliver their children to Jerusalem. But those ships aren't sailing east toward the Holy Land. They're turning southeast. When 2 of those ships finally reach land 3 weeks later, the holds open and 30,000 children pour out like cargo. Because that's what they are now, not crusaders. Not pilgrims blessed by priests and sent by God. Cargo. Boys sorted by age and strength, examined like livestock, marked with chalk. Girls separated, evaluated for different purposes. The youngest ones, some barely 5 years old, crying for parents who are 900 miles away, believing their children are performing miracles in the Holy Land. The merchants smile as they unload them. Not the cruel smiles of villains from stories, just the satisfied smiles of businessmen watching investments pay off. Hugh the Iron, a Venetian trader whose name will echo through church records for the next 8 centuries, stands on the dock with a ledger. He's counting, tallying, calculating profit margins while children weep at his feet. When 30,000 children march south believing the Mediterranean will part like the Red Sea, and merchants see not a miracle, but the most profitable cargo run of their careers. Part I. To understand how 30,000 parents could let their children walk into the abyss, you have to understand the air they were breathing. It wasn't a time of glory. It was a time of spiritual exhaustion. For 20 years, the adults of Europe had failed. The Third Crusade, led by kings and lions, had failed to retake Jerusalem. The Fourth Crusade had been a grotesque parody that ended with Christians sacking the Christian city of Constantinople. The Albigensian Crusade was currently raging in the south of France, turning neighbor against neighbor in a bloodbath of heresy hunting. The people were tired. They were starving. And more than anything, they were ashamed. The pulpits thundered with the same message every Sunday. God is punishing us. We are too sinful. We are too greedy. The Holy Land cannot be won by men with blood on their hands. The collective psyche of Europe was cracking under the weight of this guilt. They were desperate for purity. They were desperate for a sign that God hadn't abandoned them. And then, in the rolling hills of the Orléanais region, a 12-year-old shepherd boy named Stephen walked out of a field and said, "I have a letter from Jesus." It sounds insane to us. In 2024, we would call Child Protective Services. We would medicate him. But in 1212, insanity was just another word for prophecy. Stephen of Cloyes wasn't a prince. He wasn't a priest. He was a puer, a term that in Latin meant child, but in the social hierarchy of the time meant something closer to nobody. He was illiterate, poor, and unwashed. But when he opened his mouth, people stopped walking. He claimed that while tending his sheep, a pilgrim had appeared to him. This pilgrim accepted a crust of bread from Stephen, and in return, handed him a scroll. The pilgrim, Stephen said with eyes that burned with terrifying certainty, was the Christ, and the letter was an order to the King of France. Stephen didn't go home to his mother. He began to walk, and as he walked toward Paris, the strangest thing happened. Other children began to follow him, not just 1 or 2, dozens, then hundreds. They converged on the town of Saint-Denis, just north of Paris. It was June, the time of the Lendit Fair, where merchants gathered from all over Europe to sell cloth and wine. But that year, the noise of commerce was drowned out by the chanting of children. Imagine the scene. A sea of small faces, dirty, hungry, but glowing with a frantic, supernatural energy. In the center of them stands Stephen, holding a scroll he cannot read, demanding an audience with the most powerful man in France. Part 2. The King's Rejection. King Philip II, known to history as Philip Augustus, was not a man prone to mysticism. He was a builder of walls, a unifier of lands, a cold pragmatist who had spent his life outmaneuvering the English Plantagenets. When he heard that a shepherd boy was camped outside his abbey claiming to have mail from the Messiah, he didn't fall to his knees. He was annoyed. The Chronicle of the Anonyme de Laon tells us exactly what happened. The king was holding court at Saint-Denis. He looked out at the mob of children, boys with shepherd crooks, girls holding wooden crosses, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and hysteria. Not a military one, but a social one. Unrest in the lower classes was a disease, and Philip was a surgeon. He consulted the masters of the University of Paris, the greatest theological minds of the age. They looked at Stephen, they looked at the letter, and they gave the king their verdict. This is not God. This is delusion. So Philip issued a decree. It was short, sensible, and completely ignored. Go home, the king said. Go back to your parents. Go back to your sheep. The crowd disperses. The boy goes home to grow up and forget he ever thought he was a prophet. But this wasn't a normal story. This was a contagion. When Stephen heard the king's command, he didn't shrink. He didn't apologize. He walked out to the crowd of thousands who were waiting for the king's blessing. And he gave them something more dangerous. He gave them a new narrative. The king is afraid, Stephen shouted. The adults are afraid. They are too attached to their gold, their lands, their sins. They cannot retake Jerusalem because they are impure. But we are weak. We are poor. We are innocent. And that is why we will succeed. He told them the plan. It was simple. It was impossible. They would march to the sea. Not to catch ships. Ships were for adults who needs money. And maps. No. Stephen promised them a miracle. When we reach the Mediterranean, he declared, the waters will part for us as the Red Sea parted for Moses. We will walk dry-shod to the Holy Land. We will convert the Saracens not with swords, but with the purity of our words. It was the ultimate rebellion, a rejection of the entire adult world. You failed with your armor and your politics. Watch us win with nothing but our innocence. Part 3. The fire spreads. The message didn't just stay in Saint Denis, it traveled like a shockwave. Throughout that hot June and July, the roads of France filled with small figures. We have accounts from bewildered priests in villages 300 miles away. They describe children dropping their tools in the fields and simply walking away. Where are you going? Parents would scream. To God, the children would answer. They formed columns. They made flags out of rags. They sang hymns, Fairest Lord Jesus, their high voices echoing through the valleys of the Loire and the Rhône. And the parents? This is the part that haunts us. Why didn't they stop them? Why didn't they lock the doors? Some did. We know of fathers who locked their sons in cellars, only to have them break down the doors or refuse to eat until they were released. But many others, let them go. You have to remember the crushing guilt of the era. If your child said, God is calling me, and you stood in their way, were you damning their soul? Were you blocking a miracle? In a world where the afterlife was more real than the harvest, many parents wept, kissed their children goodbye, and handed them a loaf of bread, believing they were making a holy sacrifice like Abraham with Isaac. By mid-July, the army was moving, 30,000 strong. There were boys of 12 and 13, strong enough to walk the 20 miles a day Stephen demanded. There were girls of 10, holding hands in long chains so they wouldn't get lost. There were younger ones, 6 and 7 years old, struggling to keep up, their small legs pumping to match the rhythm of the hymns. And at the front, riding in a cart that was now decorated with tapestries and flowers, sat Stephen. The shepherd boy had become a saint. Relic hunters were already following the procession, snatching snips of his hair or threads from his tunic. They moved south, toward the heat, toward the coast, toward the reality that was waiting to crush them. They had no maps. They had no food supplies. They had no tents. They had only the promise that God would provide. But as they left the temperate north and entered the baking valleys of the Rhône, the summer of 1212 turned hostile. The crops had been poor that year. The wells were low. And 30,000 extra mouths is not a pilgrimage. It is a locust swarm. The locals, initially charmed by the singing children, began to lock their granaries. The charity of the faithful began to dry up. The first children began to die before they even reached Lyon. Not from Saracen arrows, but from dehydration, from dysentery, from the sheer physical impossibility of what they were trying to do. But they didn't stop. They stepped over the bodies of their friends. They left the weak by the roadside to the mercy of strangers. They kept their eyes fixed on the southern horizon, waiting for the smell of salt air, because Stephen had promised them the sea would part, the suffering would end, the miracle was waiting. They had no idea that the only thing waiting for them in Marseille was Hugh the Iron. And he wasn't planning on parting any waters. He was planning on filling his holds. Part 4. The attrition of innocence. France is not a small country. From the flatlands of Saint-Denis to the coast of Marseille is a journey of nearly 500 miles. For a mounted knight, it is a hard ride. For a peasant with a cart, it is a month of toil. For a 7-year-old child with no shoes, it is a death sentence. The summer of 1212 was recorded in monastic chronicles as particularly unforgiving. The sun beat down on the Rhône Valley, turning the dust of the road into a choking fog that coated the children's lungs. The singing stopped first. In the first week, they had marched with the energy of a festival. By the third week, the column was a silent, shuffling ghost train. The vibrant banners of Christ were tattered, bleached white by the sun. The wooden crosses were being used as crutches. Hunger began to change the dynamic of the crusade. In the beginning, they shared everything. A crust of bread was broken into 4 pieces. A water skin was passed down the line until it was dry. But as ribs began to push against skin, the instinct for survival began to override the instinct for charity. We have dark accounts from the town of Lyon. A local chronicler noted that the children who passed through were wild-eyed and that they foraged like animals in the refuse heaps. When they couldn't find food, they ate roots, berries, and sometimes things that shouldn't be eaten. Dysentery swept through the ranks like a scythe. It is a gruesome, humiliating way to die, and it took the youngest first. The roadsides became dotted with small mounds of earth. At first, the other children would stop to pray over the fallen. The column simply walked around the bodies, eyes fixed forward, numb to the loss. Stephen, riding in his cart, shielded from the worst of the heat, told them this was necessary. He would shout to the weary faces. Just as he tested the Israelites in the desert, the weak fall, so the strong may witness the glory. It was a terrifying logic. If you died, it was because your faith wasn't strong enough. If you survived, it was proof of your purity. So the children forced themselves to walk on bleeding feet, terrified that stopping meant spiritual failure. But the elements weren't the only enemy. As the column stretched out, it attracted predators. Wolves followed the scent of sickness from the forests of Burgundy. But worse were the human wolves. Kidnappers, slavers, and thieves began to shadow the crusade. They would wait for nightfall, when the exhausted children collapsed in fields or town squares. They would move through the sleeping mass, silent as smoke, and in the morning, 5 or 6 children would be gone. There was no one to report them to. No police force, no Amber Alert. Just a gap in the line, where a brother or sister used to be. The adults who had accompanied the crusade, a handful of priests, and a few desperate parents were overwhelmed. By the time the crusade reached the city of Avignon, the 30,000 had become 20,000. 10,000 children lost to the road, buried in shallow graves, snatched in the night, or simply left behind in villages, too weak to take another step, begging for scraps at the doors of strangers. And yet, they kept moving, because the sea was getting closer. Part V. The miracle that wasn't. It was late August when they smelled the salt. A ripple of energy went through the survivors. The air changed. The oppressive heat of the inland valley gave way to the humid, breezy touch of the Mediterranean. They crested the final hills overlooking Marseille, and there it was, the Great Sea. To children who had never left their landlocked villages, it must have looked like the edge of the world, a vast, shimmering expanse of blue that stretched into eternity. They ran, forgetting their blisters, forgetting their hunger. They poured down the hills toward the city. The people of Marseille came out of their houses, stunned by the spectacle. 20,000 ragged, sun-scorched scarecrows flooding their streets, weeping with joy, rushing toward the harbour. Stephen led them to the water's edge. This was it, the moment of truth, the payoff for every blister, every hunger pang, every friend buried in the dirt. The crowd gathered on the beach. The citizens of Marseille watched from the docks, a mix of pity and curiosity. The children fell to their knees in the sand. Stephen stood at the shoreline. He raised his arms, just as Moses had done. He commanded the waters to part. "Open!" he screamed. "Make way for the army of God." The waves lapped against the shore. A seagull cried overhead. The water did not move. He prayed harder. The children behind him joined in, a low murmur of desperate pleading rising from thousands of throats. "Lord, we are here. We have walked through the fire. We have bled for you. Open the door." They waited for an hour, then 2. The tide didn't go out. In fact, it came in. The cold water washed over Stephen's feet. soaking the hem of his tunic. A profound, hollow silence that swallowed the beach. The sun began to set. The miracle had failed. Confusion turned to panic. Some children collapsed in the sand, sobbing uncontrollably. Others turned on Stephen, shouting, throwing stones. "You lied! You promised!" The citizens of Marseille, seeing the mood turn ugly, began to retreat into their walled city. They didn't want a riot of desperate, starving zealots on their hands. That night was the darkest of the Crusade. The children huddled on the beach, shivering in the sea breeze. The dream was dead. God had not shown up. They were stranded 500 miles from home, with no food, no money, and no hope. The crusade began to dissolve. The older ones, realizing the game was up, started to drift away, looking for work on the docks or begging for food. But the younger ones just waited. They didn't know what else to do. They waited for Stephen to fix it. And the next morning, 2 men appeared who said they could. Part VI, the Iron, and the Pig. History gives us their names. And because we know their names, we know that evil often wears the face of charity. Hugh the Iron, Hugo Ferius, and William the Pig, Guillaume Porcus. They were merchants of Marseille. Men of significant power and influence. They were not nobility. They were part of the rising merchant class men who made their fortunes on the dangerous trade routes between Europe and the East. They walked onto the beach the morning after the failed miracle. They were dressed in fine wool, clean and fed, a stark contrast to the skeleton army shivering in the sand. They asked to speak to Stephen. They didn't mock him. They didn't laugh at his failed prophecy. They spoke to him with grave, pious faces. Hugh told the boy, his voice smooth as oil. "Because he knew you were too weary to walk to Jerusalem. The journey is too long. The Saracens too dangerous." William nodded, gesturing to the harbour where 7 great ships bobbed at anchor. "We cannot fight, but we can sail." The offer was simple. They would transport the entire army to the Holy Land, for free. "For the glory of Christ," Hugh said. "We seek no payment. Your prayers in Jerusalem will be our reward." It was the answer to every prayer. The miracle hadn't failed. It had just changed form. God hadn't sent a path through the water. He had sent ships to float over it. Stephen, desperate to salvage his crusade and his ego, accepted immediately. He turned to the weeping masses and declared that this was the true plan all along. The loading began the next day. It was chaotic. The ships were large merchant vessels, round-hulled and deep-bellied, designed to carry grain, wine, or timber. Now, they were packed with children. Hugh and William stood on the gangplanks, supervising the loading. This is where the historian pauses, looking for a sign of hesitation. A flicker of conscience. There is none. They separated the children. This is a key detail. They claimed it was for balance and safety. The little ones on the Saint Michel, William ordered. The priests and the older boys on the Saint Marie. It was a tactic. By separating the adults, the few priests and parents who had survived from the children, they removed the only people who might ask questions, who might notice that the ships were being provisioned, not for a journey to Palestine, but for something else, who might notice the chains stored deep in the ballast. 7 ships were filled, approximately 700 children per ship. The locals of Marseille cheered as the fleet prepared to leave. To them, this was a relief. The starving mob was leaving their city. The problem was sailing away. On the deck of the lead ship, Stephen stood at the prow, the wind catching his hair. He looked back at France one last time. He believed he was the new Moses. He believed he was leading his people to the promised land. He didn't know that Hugh the Iron had already signed a contract in Alexandria. He didn't know that the price of a healthy Christian boy in the markets of Egypt was at an all-time high. The anchors were weighed. The white sails caught the mistral wind. The mothers on the dock, the few who had followed the crusade this far, waved goodbye. They wept with relief. Thank God, they thought. Thank God for good men like Hugh and William. The ships moved out of the harbour, past the Château d'If, and into the open sea. For the children, the nightmare of the road was over. The nightmare of the water was about to begin. Part 7, the long silence. Before we step onto those ships, we need to understand the silence. For 18 years, Europe heard nothing. Think about that. 30,000 children marched out of France in the summer of 1212. They reached the sea. They boarded ships. And then, they vanished. For nearly 2 decades, Parents in the Loire Valley, in Paris, in Orléans, waited. They stood by their doors in the evening, watching the road. They left candles burning in windows. They prayed to Street Christopher, the patron of travellers, but no one came back. Not a single child, not a single letter, not a single rumour. It was as if the earth had opened up and swallowed an entire generation. The church tried to fill the silence with theology. Priests told grieving mothers that their children had likely been taken directly to heaven, spared the sins of adulthood. They were too pure for this world, the bishops said. It was a comforting lie. It transformed a tragedy into a mystery. But in 1230, the silence broke. A man arrived in France. He was ragged, emaciated. His skin burned dark by the desert sun. He spoke French, but with a strange, guttural accent, the tongue of a man who hadn't heard his own language in half a lifetime. He wasn't a child anymore. He was a priest in his 30s, and he had a story that would shatter the mystery of the Children's Crusade and replace it with a horror so specific, so bureaucratic, and so cruel that it remains one of the darkest stains on human history. He told them about the ships, he told them about the storm, and he told them about the price of a child in the markets of Cairo. Part 8. The floating coffins. Let's go back to the ships. The vessel of choice for Mediterranean merchants in the 13th century was the cog, or the round ship. These were not the sleek, fast caravels that Columbus would sail 3 centuries later. These were floating tubs, broad-beamed, high-walled, designed for maximum cargo capacity. They were slow, they were clumsy, and they were entirely dependent on the wind. Hugh the Iron and William the Pig had 7 of them. When the children boarded, they were ecstatic. They were singing Veni Creator Spiritus. They saw the masts reaching up to the sky like church spires. They saw the sails billowing like the wings of angels. But as soon as the coast of France disappeared, the reality of maritime travel in the Middle Ages set in. 700 children were packed into a space designed for sacks of grain. The below decks of a medieval cog was a dark, unventilated cavern. There were no portholes. There were no toilets. There were no bunks. Just the curved wooden ribs of the hull and the sloshing bilge water beneath the floorboards, a foul mixture of seawater, rat urine, and rotting waste. The children were crammed in, shoulder to shoulder. The heat was immediate and suffocating. Within hours, the air in the hold became thick with the smell of vomit. Seasickness is not just nausea, it is a total physical collapse, and for children already weakened by months of starvation on the road, it was devastating. The hatches were battened down. This is a critical detail. Hugh and William claimed it was for safety, to keep the children from falling overboard in the swells. But practically, it turned the ships into prisons. For the first 2 days, the fleet sailed south, hugging the coast of Sardinia. The children, in their naivety, assumed this was the way to Jerusalem. They didn't know geography. They didn't know that the Holy Land lay to the east, and they were sailing south. But the few priests on board, the adults who had been separated onto the Sainte Marie, they noticed. Father Nicholas, a young cleric from Cologne who had joined the Crusade in Lyon, would have watched the sun rise and set with growing dread. He knew the stars. He knew that to reach Acre or Jaffa, the ships should be steering into the rising sun. Instead, they were keeping the setting sun on their right. Why do we sail south? He might have asked the captain of the Sainte Marie. The captain, a man on Hugh the Iron's payroll, likely spat on the deck and pointed to the sky. The winds. Father, we must follow the winds. It was a lie. The winds were favourable. They were sailing south because that's where the buyers were. Part IX. The fury of San Pietro. On the 3rd day, the sky turned the colour of a bruise. The Mediterranean is deceptive. It can be a mill pond for months, and then, in an hour, it can become a killer. A gregale. A fierce northeast wind began to howl across the open water. The fleet was near the island of San Pietro, off the southwestern tip of Sardinia. It is a rugged, unforgiving coast, lined with jagged cliffs and hidden shoals that have claimed sailors since the time of the Phoenicians. The storm hit at night. Inside the holds, it must have been like being inside a drum beaten by a giant. The ships pitched violently, rolling 40 degrees to one side, then snapping back. Children were thrown across the dark cavern, piling onto one another, screaming in terror. The sound was deafening, the creaking of the timbers, the roar of the wind, the crashing of tons of water against the hull. They prayed. They screamed for their mothers. They screamed for Stephen. Save us. Miracle. Miracle. But Stephen was on the lead ship, likely puking his heart out in a cabin. Just as terrified as they were, the fleet became separated. In the darkness and the rain, the lanterns on the sterns vanished. Two of the ships, we don't know their names. Only their fate were driven too close to the island of San Pietro. The rocks here are razor-sharp volcanic stone. When a wooden hull hits them, it doesn't just crack, it shatters. Imagine the moment of impact. A grinding screech that drowns out the thunder. The hull breaches. The ocean rushes in cold, black, and relentless. For the 700 children trapped in the hold of the first ship, there was no chance. The water would have filled the space in minutes. The hatches were battened down. They were rats in a trap. There were no lifeboats. There were no life jackets. The ship would have rolled over and gone down like a stone, taking 700 prayers, 700 names, 700 futures with it. The second ship followed moments later. It struck a reef further out. The mast snapped, crushing the deck. It foundered in the swells, breaking apart. Some children might have made it into the water, thrashing in the dark, choking on the salt spray, reaching out for debris. But the sea off San Pietro is deep, and the currents are strong. In the morning, the storm broke. The sun rose over a calm, indifferent sea. Wreckage washed up on the beaches of San Pietro for weeks. Small tunics, wooden crosses, sandals, bodies. The locals of the island, simple fishermen who knew nothing of a crusade, must have been horrified. Those graves are still there, somewhere beneath the sand and the wild rosemary, unnamed and unvisited. 1,400 children died that night. But for the survivors on the remaining 5 ships, the horror was just beginning. Because, as the sun rose and the battered fleet regrouped, Hugh the Iron made a decision. He didn't turn back. He didn't sail for the nearest Christian port to repair the ships and mourn the dead. He signaled the captains, due south. The pretense was over. The cargo had been damaged, yes, but he still had 5 shiploads of product. And he had a delivery schedule to keep. Part X, the betrayal revealed. The 5 surviving ships limped across the open Mediterranean. The mood on board had shifted from fear to a catatonic shock. The children knew their friends were dead. They had heard the screams in the night. They had seen the other ships vanish. They were dehydrated, starving, and traumatized. But they were still alive. They told themselves that this was the final test. God saved us from the storm, they whispered. He has a purpose for us. Then they saw land. It wasn't the green hills of Galilee. It wasn't the stone walls of Acre. It was the golden, burning coast of Africa. The ships sailed into the harbour of Bougie, modern-day Béjaïa, in Algeria. It was a bustling port of the Almohad Caliphate, a place of stunning architecture, busy markets, and the call of the muezzin echoing from the minarets. To the children, it was an alien world. They saw men in turbans and flowing robes. They heard a language that sounded nothing like the Latin or French they knew. They saw the crescents on the flags, the Saracens. Panic rippled through the holds. Have we arrived to convert them? Some asked. Is this the crusade? The hatches were thrown open. But it wasn't Stephen who addressed them. It was Hugh the Iron. He stood on the deck, surrounded by armed guards, Saracen mercenaries with curved scimitars. The mask of the pious merchant was gone. You are not crusaders, Hugh told them. The words were cold, precise. You are not here to convert anyone. You are here to pay a debt. He explained it to them. The trip wasn't free. The ships weren't charity. They were an investment. And now, the investors were collecting. The letter from Christ that Stephen carried. A delusion. The voice of God. A hallucination, brought on by hunger and hysteria. The only reality here was the ledger. The children were dragged up from the holds. Blinded by the sudden sunlight, stumbling on atrophied legs, they were herded onto the docks of Bougie. The illusion of the crusade ended not with a bang, but with the clinking of chains. Part XI, the economics of innocence. We must pause here to look at the invisible machinery of the 13th century slave trade. Slavery in the medieval Mediterranean was a complex, booming industry. It wasn't based on race. It was based on religion. Christians enslaved Muslims. Muslims enslaved Christians. It was the engine that powered galleys, mines, and households on both sides of the sea. But these children, they were a premium commodity. In the markets of the Ayyubid Sultanate, a healthy young boy was valuable. He could be trained as a Mamluk, a slave soldier. Mamluks were the elite warriors of the Islamic world, prized for their loyalty because they had no family ties, no clan allegiances. A boy taken at 12, converted to Islam, and trained in the sword was a perfect weapon. And the girls? Northerners' fair skin, light hair, blue eyes were considered exotic and highly desirable for the harems of high-ranking officials. Hugh the Iron knew the market. He knew that selling them in bulk would lower the price, so he split the inventory. In Bougie, he sold the first batch, 400 children, mostly the older boys, the ones who looked strong enough for labor, and the girls who were deemed less perfect. The transaction was banal. The children were lined up. Buyers inspected their teeth, felt their muscles, checked their eyes for disease. Money changed hands, dinars, not livres. The children screamed for each other as they were separated. Brothers torn from sisters, friends from the same village, who had walked 500 miles holding hands, ripped apart by guards who didn't understand a word of their pleading. "Stephen! Stephen!" they cried, but Stephen was gone. The boy prophet vanishes from history at this exact moment. Did he die in the storm? Was he sold in the first lot? Or did Hugh the Iron keep him for a special purpose? We don't know. The shepherd who promised to part the sea was likely sold for the price of a good horse, disappearing into the anonymity of servitude. After Bougie, the 4 remaining ships sailed east, to the jewel of the trade. Alexandria. Part 12. The Great Market of Alexandria. Alexandria was the New York City of the Middle Ages, a metropolis of trade, culture, and power. It was the gateway to Egypt and the seat of Governor Al-Kamel, who would later become Sultan. When the ships arrived in Alexandria, the scale of the operation became clear. This wasn't a back alley deal. This was a wholesale liquidation. Hugh the Iron and William the Pig were greeted by officials of the Sultan. They had paperwork. They had permits. This had been arranged months in advance. While the children were marching through France singing hymns, these men were likely already negotiating the contract in Cairo. The remaining children, thousands of them, were unloaded into the slave pens of the city. This is the emotional nadir of our story. Imagine a 12-year-old girl named Marie. She is a peasant from a village near Paris. She has never committed a sin in her life. She walked across France because she wanted to save the Holy Sepulchre. She survived the hunger. She survived the road. She survived the storm that killed her brother on the other ship. Now, she stands on a wooden block in a sun-drenched square in Egypt. She is surrounded by men speaking Arabic. She is being bid on. She looks at Hugh the Iron, the man she thought was sent by God. He is drinking wine with a buyer, laughing, pointing at her. The betrayal is total. It is spiritual, physical, and emotional. The universe has not just been indifferent, it has been actively malicious. The records, scant as they are, tell us that the bulk of the children were bought by 2 groups. The governor, Al-Kamel, bought hundreds of the boys. He needed bright, young minds for his administration and strong bodies for his army. The interpreters. A strange detail from the priest's testimony says that many were bought to be trained as translators. Europe and the East were constantly at war and constantly in trade. There was a desperate need for people who spoke fluent French and Latin, but served the Sultan. And so, the army of God was dissolved. They didn't die as martyrs. They didn't conquer Jerusalem. They were absorbed. They were given new names. They were forced to convert to Islam, not always by the sword, but by the simple reality that to eat, to survive, to have a life in this new world, you had to belong to it. Marie became Mariam. Jean became Yusuf. They grew up. They learned Arabic. They forgot the faces of their mothers. They forgot the smell of the French rain. Or did they? Part 13, The 18 Scholars. There is one final, haunting detail from the survivor's testimony. He claimed that not all the children were sold into slavery. He said that 18 of them, the brightest, the most articulate, were sent even further east, to Baghdad. Baghdad in the 13th century was the intellectual capital of the world, the house of wisdom, the center of science, astronomy, and philosophy. The Caliph of Baghdad, hearing of this strange crusade of innocence, reportedly asked for some of them to be sent to him, not as slaves, but as curiosities, as students. The priest claimed that 18 of the children grew up in the Caliph's court. They were educated in the sciences. They learned Aristotle and Plato in Arabic. They became scholars. It is a beautiful, agonizing image. 18 French peasants who left home to die for Christ, ending their lives as Islamic scholars in the libraries of Baghdad, staring at the stars, wondering if the constellation they were mapping was the same one their mothers were looking at back in Orléans. Did they talk to each other in French when the guards weren't listening? Did they hum Fairest Lord Jesus in the quiet of the library? We will never know. By 1230, the priest who returned was the only thread connecting these lost lives back to the world that had forgotten them. He finished his story in a church in France. The congregation sat in stunned silence. The parents who were still alive, now old and grey, finally had their answer. It wasn't the answer they wanted. There was no glory. There was no miracle. There was only the ledger of Hugh the Iron. Part XIV. The fate of the wolves. Hugh and William became rich men. The profits from the Children's Crusade set them up for life. They continued to trade, to sail, to profit from the misery of the world. But greed is a fire that consumes its host. Years later, seeking an even bigger payday, they attempted a plot so audacious it bordered on suicide. They tried to kidnap the Pope, or at least a high-ranking legate of the Pope. They planned to seize a papal ship and hold the envoys for ransom, but this time, their luck ran out. The plot was discovered. They were captured not by starry-eyed children, but by the relentless enforcers of the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick II. Frederick was not a man of mercy. When he discovered that these were the same men who had sold the Children's Crusade, a scandal that still rankled the Christian world, he decided to make an example of them. They were dragged to the gallows in Sicily. As the noose was placed around Hugh the Iron's neck, did he think of the beach in Marseille? Did he see the faces of the 700 children he sent to the bottom of the sea at San Pietro? Probably not. Men like that rarely have epiphanies. He probably just thought about the money he was leaving behind. The 30,000 were scattered like seeds in the wind. In the harems of Cairo, in the barracks of the Mamluks, in the libraries of Baghdad, and in the coral reefs of Sardinia. They were the lost generation. The price Europe paid for its fanaticism. And as the years turned into centuries, the story faded. It became a legend, then a fairy tale. The Pied Piper of Hamelin, a story about a man who leads children away when the town refuses to pay him, is thought by many historians to be a dark cultural echo of this very event. We turn their tragedy into a bedtime story. We turn their horror into a nursery rhyme. Because the truth that we, the adults, let this happen, was too hard to look at. Part XV. The other prophet. While Stephen of Cloyes was leading his followers into the heat of the Rhone Valley, another fire had been lit, hundreds of miles to the east. We cannot tell the story of the Children's Crusade without looking at Germany. Because while the French tragedy was one of betrayal, the German tragedy was one of endurance. In the Rhineland, in the city of Cologne, a boy named Nicholas began to speak. He was roughly the same age as Stephen, perhaps 12 or 13. But his message was slightly different. Stephen carried a letter. Nicholas carried a cross. Specifically, a Tau cross shaped like the letter T, which was the symbol of the poor, the marginalized, and the Franciscans who were just beginning to ripple through Europe. Nicholas preached not just a march to the sea, but a conversion of the world. He told the crowds in Cologne that the Mediterranean would open for them, yes, but that their mission was to walk all the way to Jerusalem and convert the Muslims through the sheer power of their innocence. The reaction in Germany was explosive. While Philip Augustus had tried to stop the French children, the German nobility was fragmented and distracted. The Holy Roman Empire was in a state of civil chaos. There was no central authority to say stop, so they marched. If the French Crusade was an army, the German Crusade was a migration. Estimates suggest that nearly 20,000 followers gathered around Nicholas in Cologne, but they weren't just children. They were joined by the holy poor, unwed mothers, vagabonds, minor clerics who had lost their churches, and entire families who had nothing left to lose. They didn't head south toward Marseille. They headed south toward the Alps. Part 6, the Wall of Ice. To get from Germany to Italy in 1212, you had to do something that even armies feared to do. You had to cross the roof of the world. The Alps stand like a fortress between northern Europe and the Mediterranean. In summer, the passes are treacherous. In winter, they are impassable. The German Crusade reached the foothills in July. They split into two columns. One, led by Nicholas, aimed for the Great Street Bernard Pass. The other aimed for the street Gotthard Pass. History books often gloss over this with a single sentence. They crossed the Alps. But we need to pause here. We need to understand what that sentence actually means for a 10-year-old wearing linen tunics and leather sandals. As they ascended, the green valleys of Bavaria gave way to grey rock, and then to white blinding snow. The air grew thin. The temperature plummeted. These children had no equipment. They had no supply lines. They slept on the freezing ground, huddling together in body piles to share warmth. We have accounts from the hospices run by monks in the mountains. They describe a pitiable procession of ghosts emerging from the mist, blue-lipped, shivering, frostbitten. The attrition was horrific. In the French Crusade, they died of heat and dysentery. In the Alps, they died of exposure. They slipped on icy paths and fell hundreds of feet into crevasses. They simply sat down to rest and never woke up, their bodies covered by the snows of the next morning. Wolves tracked the column here, too. But the greatest killer was the cold. By the time Nicholas's group descended into the lush, warm valleys of Italy, 2/3 of them were gone. Of the 20,000 who left Cologne, perhaps 7,000 stood on the plains of Lombardy, but they had done it. They had crossed the impossible barrier, and in their minds, this was the proof. God had protected them. The worst was over. They marched toward the sea, toward Genoa, Part 7 Sieve, the gates of Genoa. On the 25th of August 1212, the citizens of Genoa woke up to a bizarre sight. Genoa was a republic. It was a city of bankers, sailors, and cynics. They were not prone to religious hysteria. When Nicholas asked for entry, the Genoese council was suspicious. They had heard rumors of this crusade, but seeing it in the flesh was disturbing. However, they were not monsters. They allowed the children to enter. For one night, the Chronicle of Genoa records the event with dry precision. The children marched to the harbour. This was it, the moment Nicholas had promised. "The sea will part," Nicholas cried. The entire city watched. The Doge of Genoa watched. The skeptics watched. The waves of the Ligurian Sea crashed against the docks. They foamed, they receded, and then they crashed again. The sea did not part. It is the same scene as Marseille, but the reaction was different. In France, the children were betrayed by merchants. In Genoa, they were pitied by realists. The Genoese council made an offer. It is one of the few moments of kindness in this entire saga. They told the children, "The sea will not open. You cannot walk to Jerusalem, but if you wish, you may stay here. We will give you citizenship. We will give you work." It was an incredible offer. Citizenship in Genoa was a prize men killed for. It meant safety, wealth, and a future. Some of the children, the older ones, the wiser ones, took the offer. They stayed. They became apprentices, servants, and eventually, Genoese families. There are families in Genoa today who trace their lineage back to the German children. But Nicholas refused. His faith was not broken. It was just redirected. "If the sea will not part here," he said, "it is because we are meant to go to Rome. The Pope will tell us what to do." So, with a diminished following now, only a few thousand, Nicholas turned his back on the safety of Genoa and began the long march south to the Vatican. Part 8, the verdict of Rome. The road to Rome is long, dusty, and in the 13th century, lawless. The remnants of the German Crusade became a moving target. They were mocked in the towns they passed. "Where is your sea?" the locals would jeer. "Where is your Jerusalem?" The girls, in particular, suffered terribly. The chroniclers tell us that many were despoiled on the road. It is a polite medieval way of saying they were raped by bandits, by soldiers, and sometimes by the very people they asked for shelter. When they finally reached Rome in October, they were a shadow of the army that had left Cologne. They were granted an audience with Pope Innocent III. Innocent was a powerful, brilliant, and terrifying pope. He had launched crusades. He had excommunicated kings. He was the most powerful man in Europe. When he looked at these children, filthy, starving, holding their wooden crosses, he didn't see an army. He saw a tragedy. But he also saw a rhetorical weapon. It was here that he famously said, "These children put us to shame, for while they rush to the Holy Land, we sleep." But rhetoric doesn't feed children. Nicholas asked for the Pope's blessing to continue to Jerusalem. He asked for ships. He asked for a miracle. Innocent III shook his head. He was a realist. He knew that if these children went to the east, they would be slaughtered or enslaved. Go home, the Pope commanded. Your vows are valid, but they are suspended. When you are adults, you may fulfill them. But for now, go home. It was the final nail in the coffin. The vicar of Christ himself had told them it was over. Part Daxonix. The death of a prophet. The return journey was worse than the Crusade. Going to Jerusalem, they had hope. They had the adrenaline of a mission. Going home, they had only shame. They had to walk back up the Italian peninsula, back through the towns that had mocked them, back toward the Alps that had already killed half of them. The chronicle of the monk Alberic of Trofontaines gives us the grim details. The group shattered. They became beggars. They were treated not as holy pilgrims, but as vagrants. They returned barefoot and hungry. Alberic writes, sadness was their only companion. And Nicholas, the boy who had led 20,000 people out of Germany, never saw Cologne again. The records are hazy, but the consensus is that he died on the return journey. Some say he died of fever in the Alps. Others say he died in Italy, heartbroken and abandoned by his followers. His father, however, was waiting in Cologne, and this is where the story turns into a grim lesson on accountability. When the few survivors finally trickled back into the Rhineland, emaciated, traumatized, telling stories of death in the snow, the parents of the dead children went looking for someone to blame. They found Nicholas's father. They dragged him from his house. They accused him of encouraging the boy, of profiting from the hysteria. There were rumors he had sold souvenirs of his son. They hanged him. It was the final act of violence in a summer of madness. The crusade had begun with a vision of Jesus and ended with a lynching in a muddy German square, Part XX, the Pueri mistake. For centuries, historians have argued about what actually happened in 1212. Was it really children? In the mid-20th century, a theory gained traction. The Latin word used in the chronicles is pueri. In classical Latin, pueri means boys or children. But in the socio-economic context of the 13th century, pueri was also used to describe landless peasants or dependents. Pueri could be a 20-year-old farmhand who didn't own land. So, some historians argued, this wasn't a children's crusade, it was a peasants' crusade. A social uprising of the poor, the marginalized, the little people rising up against the failure of the knightly class. It's a compelling theory. It makes the story less grotesque. It makes it about class warfare rather than child abuse. But modern scholarship has swung back. When you read the specific details, mothers weeping, the king telling them to return to their parents, the descriptions of their beardless faces and high voices, it becomes undeniable. While there were certainly poor adults among them, the holy poor, the core of the movement, the spark, and the vast majority of the participants were young. It was a youth movement. It was a medieval, generational rebellion. The children looked at the world their parents had built, a world of constant war, greed, and failure, and said, we can do better. We can fix this with purity. And the adults, crushed by their own guilt, let them try. Part XXI. The Pied Piper connection. The trauma of 1212 didn't just vanish. It festered in the European subconscious. It mutated into folklore. 70 years later, in 1284, the town of Hamelin in Germany recorded a strange event. The town records state, it is 100 years since our children left, referring to a date in June. The story of the Pied Piper, a man in multicolored clothes who lures the children away with a pipe when the town refuses to pay him for removing the rats, is almost certainly a cultural echo of the Children's Crusade and the German expansion to the east, Ostsiedlung. The piper represents the recruiters. We turned the horror of 1212 into a fairy tale because the reality was too painful to explain to our children at bedtime. We created a magic flute to explain why an entire generation walked away and never came back. Part XX. Why we must remember. So, why dig this up? Why spend 14,000 words dissecting a tragedy from 800 years ago? Because the Children's Crusade is not just a story about the Middle Ages. It is a story about the danger of weaponized hope. Stephen and Nicholas weren't villains. They were dreamers. They truly believed that faith could move mountains and part seas. But they were surrounded by adults who should have known better. The King of France knew better, but he only issued a half-hearted decree. The parents knew better, but they were paralyzed by religious guilt. The church knew better, but they waited until it was too late to intervene. The merchants knew better, and they monetized it. Hugh the Iron and William the Pig are not anomalies. They are archetypes. In every age, when there is a crisis, when people are desperate and looking for a miracle, there will always be someone waiting on the dock with a ship, promising that for a small price, he can take you to the promised land. We see it in the human traffickers of today. We see it in the cult leaders who promise salvation. We see it in the get-rich-quick schemes that prey on the desperate. The dynamic never changes. Only the technology does. Part XX3I. The final vigil. Let's go back to the sea one last time. In 2024, if you go to the island of San Pietro off Sardinia, the water is still impossibly blue. It looks innocent. It looks peaceful. But if you know where to look, there is a small ruin near the coast. Locals say it is the Church of the New Innocence, built by Pope Gregory IX to honor the bodies that washed ashore in 1212. There are no names on the stones, no list of the fallen, but imagine for a moment that you can see them. Not as a statistic of 30,000, but as individuals. The boy from Orléans, who loved to carve wooden horses. The girl from Cologne, who promised her mother she would bring back a bottle of water from the Jordan River. The brothers who held hands as the Saint Michel went down in the dark. They were not cargo. They were not pueri. They were children. They wanted to save the world. And the world answered by devouring them. History is often written by the victors. It is written by the kings who conquer, the merchants who profit, and the popes who build cathedrals. But here, on Crimson Historians, we don't write for the victors. We write for the vanished. We write for the silence that follows the storm. We write so that 800 years later, someone, somewhere, will stop scrolling, take a breath, and remember that they existed. They marched, they sang, they believed, and they deserve to be more than just a footnote in a textbook. They deserve to be mourned. If this story made you feel the weight of that silence, if it made you look at the ocean a little differently, then do the only thing we can do for them now: remember them. This has been the tragedy of the Children's Crusade. I'm the Vanished Archive. Don't just learn history, feel it.